Well, hello, my name's Paul Ramadge. I'm Managing Director of the Plus Alliance. And today we interview Professor Richard Bryant from the University of New South Wales in a continuing series of special conversations with leaders from across the Plus Alliance. Let me take a moment to introduce Richard before we open up the discussion. He is, of course, one of Australia's most noted medical scientists. He's a Professor of Psychology at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and he's Director of the University of New South Wales Traumatic Stress Clinic. He's built a reputation for being an international leader in post-traumatic stress disorder and prolonged grief disorder. And this reputation has taken him across Australia and internationally to deal with some of the biggest events we've seen in the world. The 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York, the 2004 Asian tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, and closer to home in Australia, the Black Saturday bushfires. In 2016, Richard was appointed a Companion of the Order of Australia for his service to medical research as a psychologist and an author. Richard, it's an honour to welcome you today.
Thanks, Paul. And I think I should bring you along every time I have to do an undergraduate psychology lecture to introduce me.
Well, I think it's a very well-deserved introduction, and you really are one of the great leaders in the Plus Alliance. And Richard, if I may, I'd like to just start on a fairly personal level. It's quite a CV that you have. How did your career begin? You know, who were the people or what were the events that led you to become a psychologist? And just out of interest, was it somebody in your family or a close friend who influenced you?
I think, like a lot of people, we stumble into our professions. I often get asked why I became a psychologist, and I really don't know. Certainly nobody in my family ever was. I came from a working class family, and we never had money for anybody to go to university before my generation. I just, like a lot of people, I just did a smattering of courses in my first year, and way back in the late 70s, I actually started at University of New South Wales as a young student. I enjoyed psychology. It was fun, and that's what got me into it. And then later, I got into the area of traumatic stress, after doing a master's and a PhD. And again, people often ask, why did I get into PTSD as a focus of study? And again, it was total fluke. I had to go and get a job, had a mortgage to pay. So I had a job at a hospital. I think I was actually meant to start working in the maternity ward, doing sort of liaison work. But the person who was actually working trauma and burns, they suddenly left, and I was asked to actually fill in that role. So I started seeing burns patients and trauma patients, and that got me into the whole field of traumatic stress.
It's amazing, Richard. Meant to be going towards maternity and ended up in burns. And I understand that was at Westmead Hospital in Western Sydney. And if I could ask you to just go back to those days, you know, what did you learn about protecting patients' coping strategies? You know, what are some of those very early lessons that have stayed with you?
Well, it's a funny thing when you think back to when I started compared to where we are now. The whole field of PTSD was just not really known. It's hard to imagine now, but it was in its very, very early days of its infancy. So we're really stumbling along trying to work out what to do. And I think being with burns patients in particular, which is the injury is horrendous, but the treatment's actually far, far worse. If anybody who's worked on a burns unit, and I spent years there. And basically you learn that every single person is an individual. Everybody's got completely different ways of coping. They bring a completely different history to a traumatic experience. And you can't just apply a cookbook to every human being. We're all too different for that.
No, it's very interesting, Richard. And I wonder, thinking about the many different types of viewers that are joining us today, it might be worth us just pausing and having a little bit of a think about post-traumatic stress syndrome. What is it exactly? How did this term come about, and how has it grown since those days in the 70s and 80s?
Well, it has been talked about and known for thousands of years, since the ancient Greeks. We've got documentation about it. And then we've got a lot more documentation in World War One, the trench warfare on the Western Front in particular was, absolutely horrendous. And if you read the accounts of what went on then, it was graphically PTSD. But it really wasn't until the 80s that it got formalized as a construct, a diagnosis. And that was really as an attempt for the Americans, the American psychiatric world, to come to grips with all the veterans coming back from Vietnam with the psychological problems they were having. And this then led to the definition of PTSD, which, as we understand it now, is very much a fear disorder, characterized and driven a lot by people who just can't get over that sense that I am still in danger. They still have these intrusive memories or flashback memories or nightmares, and they just keep reliving what they've been through. And this brings with it a great deal of anxiety and a great deal of need to avoid any reminders of it. And it's actually a lot more prevalent than people often think. Recent national studies in Australia tells us that it's nearly as prevalent as depression, and it can be debilitating.
Yes, and of course, in more modern times, in these years now, amid COVID and everything else, I think all of us, the non-academic, the lay people, have a sense of this awful affliction and can see it in many of its different forms as well. And Richard, just thinking, those years at Westmead Hospital, fairly tough kind of initiation in a burns unit, the emergence of a refined new form of academic thinking around PTSD, and as you make the transition from a hospital environment more fully to the university, first as a lecturer, then as a researcher, were there people who stood out to you, authors, lecturers, thinkers that you started to admire and started to build your work around?
I wouldn't actually nominate any one individual because, as I said, it was early days. But there were probably half a dozen people, particularly in the US, who were pioneering the strategies, the programs that are now gold standard. So we were all following those people avidly to see, what they were doing and how we could apply that to our work. Yes, and there probably were about half a dozen of them. And I know back in the late 80s, I took my first sabbatical and I spent it at Harvard. And basically, I just spent months visiting various centers in the US, these particular experts, soaking up, what they were doing, learning their techniques. And over the years, these people have become great friends of mine. And, we work together a lot on a lot of projects. But it is funny to think back. It makes me aware of just how damned old I am. That, when we started off, none of us really knew anything. And I was, very wet behind the ears and just sort of looking up to these people, trying to work out what were they doing while they sort of were pioneering this as they went.
You're very humble, Richard. Another way to say that is you've been at the cutting edge of knowledge development in your field, and you were lucky to be there in the early days when it was forming. And obviously you've seen huge transitions in the decades that have followed. And I wonder, thinking like that, if we could open up a discussion about your career and your work, and particularly about PTSD, if we could do that by thinking about COVID-19. And I wonder, what are some of the programs or projects that you've been working on during the pandemic?
Wow, how many hours have you got? COVID-19 has just taken over all our lives. And it's the nature of my sort of work, because I work in trauma and disaster. And whenever there's major events, it just sort of, if you like, it's an opportunity that we need to capitalize on, because number one, a lot of people are affected. We need to try to help them. But also, it's not just about reacting and doing what we think. We need to use our best science and use those opportunities to learn so that we can actually plan moving forward, which is often, a great omission in our field, that people aren't doing that enough. So in terms of the projects I'm doing at COVID, I mean, in Australia, we're doing a lot of treatment programs. So particularly in the context of lockdown, social isolation, etc., we have set up adaptations of programs my team developed with the World Health Organization a few years ago for low and middle income countries. And we've adapted those with the WHO specifically for COVID. So we've been doing very brief interventions, 5-6 sessions long, all done by video conferencing, so we can reach people all over Australia. And it's really not treating a disorder. It's really teaching people coping skills about how you cope with suddenly having your life turned upside down, you're cut off from your normal social networks, you can't see your family. And we know this is leading, and so many studies already this year have shown us, they're leading to, real increases in anxiety, depression, and we're projecting it to lead to, worse suicide rates, etc. So there's a desperate need to actually do trials at the moment so that we can learn. I'm also involved in a lot of European studies where we're adapting our program again in a range of the worst affected countries there in different populations. So it's health workers, it's people in aged care, others focusing on those who are unemployed. Because these are all different areas of need, and it's how do we get to the right intervention to sort of reach what is just a phenomenal number of people. And most countries just don't have the resources to immediately roll out and get the help to the people who need it in time.
Mm. You're partly answering my next thought, Richard. I'm interested to ask you, to what extent do you see a long tail of mental health disorders following the pandemic? What type of things do you envisage, and what sort of additional interventions may be required?
Well, it's not just what I think. I think that we've actually got some decent modelling coming out now from around the world. And there's really two aspects to this. Number one, there's the lingering effects of the pandemic itself. And we've seen this in SARS, for example, most particularly, but also in MERS a bit, in previous pandemics, where people who have been so affected, and particularly those who were infected and the health workers, they just have persistent anxiety and depression going on for a long time once the acute period is over. But what everybody's really concerned about is the economic downturn, because we know that that's historically a huge, huge trigger to suicide going up, anxiety, depression, family violence, a whole range of problems. And we know that economies around the world are going to be very badly affected for up to 5 years as a result of this, and particularly for younger generations, who it's usually when you're starting your career path and when that's actually been halted by this economy. That's our real concern. And that's something that we really think governments need to pay attention to, because that's not going away in a hurry. You can't turn an economy around in a hurry. And so the mental health cost of that is really going to be there.
Yes, thank you, Richard. There are many people who feel they have a right to stand up and tell governments what to do, or to, be at times provocative, and there's a lot of rhetoric in that space as well. I must say, from my perspective, you have the right. You've earned the right to be somebody who should advise governments. So thinking like that, what's the advice that you would give to governments at this point, knowing that this is going to get worse before it gets better, knowing that our young people are exposed? What do governments need to do?
I think there's probably a couple of answers to that. Number one, recognise that it's an issue. Recognise that mental health is an issue. And to be honest, in Australia, I really have to take my hat off to the Australian government, because I think we just happen to have a government at the moment that is truly recognising the role of mental health. And that's been seen in a lot of initiatives. So they do recognise it. This is not necessarily the case around the world. And that's unfortunate. I think, secondly, don't not every mental health intervention, let me put that differently. Not every way to improve a population's mental health is a mental health intervention. So clearly, going forward, one of the best ways we can of improving people's mental health is getting them jobs, putting money in their pockets, taking the pressure off people. And so we've known for a long time that these more sort of societal or infrastructure type interventions can be enormously beneficial. And I think thirdly, we need to listen to the science. And we just all keep saying this time and time again. And, we've seen around the world certain leaders who will remain nameless debunking science in the middle of the pandemic. And we've seen the cost that that's paid, by many, many people. But from a mental health perspective, again, we need to not just throw out huge buckets of money, which is nice to see in the sense that the government feels they're doing the right thing, but they need to spend that money wisely. And the best way to do that is by listening to the science.
I might join you in some of the comments you made there, Richard, by sending a warm hello to our colleagues in the United States and in the UK who are in the thick of a second wave of extraordinary measure. And we do send our best wishes. In Australia, of course, we've had a hard lockdown, particularly in Victoria. We've still got some challenges, isolated in South Australia at the moment. But again, in that context, we've talked about governments. And of course, the Plus Alliance brings together the University of New South Wales, Sydney, King's College London, Arizona State University. What do universities need to do more of? And to what extent in your field is it becoming something that can be developed across disciplines to a greater extent?
I think this is one of the exciting things in terms of the cross-disciplinary nature of it, is that I think just even in the last five years, we've made huge inroads into that approach of not remaining in our silos. And it's actually been quite constructive that things like the funding agencies, for example, are recognising this, and they're actively promoting that if you're going to take, for example, a public health approach, you've got to get outside your silo. I mean, we have to be working with health economists. We have to be working with political scientists. We have to be working with people into computational modelling. Now, I know nothing about these areas, and I don't want to, because I know that at this stage I can't master those things. So you've really got to collaborate with people who are experts in this area, and we've got to maximise our independent knowledge so we can work together and present an argument to governments that is acceptable and digestible. And I think this is something universities need to learn more of, is that governments are in a tough position. And we can't just sort of put these grand blue sky ideas to them and say, achieve this. They also have budgetary constraints. They've got logistical constraints. And we need to be smart about how we recommend solutions. And governments, in a sense, do want solutions, but they want solutions that are cost effective and that they're sustainable. And we need to think about how do we deliver what we're trying to deliver, because we're not going to get sustainable change at a government level unless we can actually have the proof and have the evidence with cost effectiveness and health systems and economic modelling data that actually says, look, these policies or these initiatives can actually work, and they can actually not just work, but they can actually fit into your budgetary plans and even save you. And there is very good data telling us that a lot of the programs that if we invest just this amount of money, governments can save a lot more.
And you've cut to the heart of the Plus Alliance as well, trying to do or to tackle some of the world's most pressing challenges across using the resources of 3 universities, not one. And of course, not just in single disciplinary fields, but across disciplines and creatively and not in novel ways. Professor Richard Bryant, you're a joy to listen to, I must say. Amazing work, huge impact. You've created a network across the world. And I have 2 final questions before a bit of a summary. The first one is, now we're in the middle of a pandemic, so your answer may relate to pandemic, or it may relate more broadly to post-traumatic stress disorder. But What's your advice to Australian hospital CEOs and chief medical officers across the country, or in fact across the world? In these times or in other times of major stress, what are 3 must-do actions that they must really monitor?
Well, this is again based on data. I think, number one is that if I'm running a hospital, I just want to look at the workload that is being put on my staff. That's not a trauma factor, but we know that the likelihood of suicide, the likelihood of mental health problems does, really increase once people get beyond a certain workload. And what's been happening in COVID is that people have been working phenomenal hours under very tough conditions. Now, Australia has not gone through anywhere near what a lot of US and also UK health systems have been through. And, the ones that I'm working with over there, it's really, really tough. So in a sense, it's just burnout. And hospital systems, health systems need to guard against that, or they're going to lose a lot of their staff. I think the other point is that in terms of providing services, what we've really learned is that healthcare workers are not selfish people. They essentially are out, they get into their jobs because they want to look after others. So the whole idea of trying to sort of offer a program and say, look, do this program because it's going to help your mental health. Health workers are renowned for very poor uptake of those programs. And that's partly because they tend not to look after themselves. They tend to look out for others. And also it's because they're concerned about their professional reputations. Is a hospital going to work, find out about that they might be depressed or something? Is that going to impact on their capacity to function as a healthcare worker? And this is them, they've worked for years and years, to be able to do this. They don't want to jeopardize it. So we need to be able to remove those barriers to care so that they can actually access services in a very confidential way that's accessible and safe for them. And thirdly, we need to pitch these things so that they don't sound like mental health. And this goes with all sorts of populations. This is about strengthening people to cope with stress through a absolutely crazy year. And let's not badge it that it's all mental health, because that's the best way to turn people off.
No, very well said, Richard. Very well said indeed. Richard, and I'm sure those watching today will agree on this. You're wonderful in how you can separate the professional and the personal. You clearly a medical scientist with extraordinary resilience and passion for what you do. But my final question does cut through that a little bit. I just ask you to reflect on, amidst all of this trauma, and so much of it is so difficult, is there one person or is there one event that really does get you out of bed every day because it was such a great outcome, it inspires you, it becomes a motivating force for you? Is there one that you can share with us?
I think one person I think of, and I honestly don't think it's anything to do with any of my programs that was instrumental here, to be honest. But a number of years ago, I was in a refugee camp on the Syrian border, and I was in a particular refugee's tent. And I visited this man's tent for several hours, and he'd been through the most horrendous trauma. He'd lost most of his family. I won't tell you what he'd been through. You wouldn't sleep for a month if I did. It was absolutely horrendous. He'd been tortured himself for months, but he'd managed to escape and had the most horrendous flight, to get out of Syria. And he had nothing. I remember he was sort of in this tent and he was sharing lunch with me. He made me this little lunch, and typical Arabic culture, they're always the host. So no matter, he had next to nothing, he was always going to share it with me. But as I heard his story, I couldn't help but asking him via the interpreter. I said, look, you've been through the most horrendous experiences. How come you just keep smiling? And he was, like every 5 minutes, he would just flash this wonderful smile. And he thought for a moment, he looked at me and he said, if I stop smiling, I will break down. And that was his attitude to just surviving with this years of horror, that basically he just had to keep functioning, had to keep smiling, had to keep putting one foot in front of another. And I think sort of what I took away from that, because it was very impactful for me at the time, was that this guy has certain resilience factors. And really what everything we're trying to do, and it's not just me, it's hundreds of people in my field are doing, we're trying to, in a very scientific way, understand what are the mechanisms that drive a person to be able to have that kind of resilience. They're biological, they're cognitive, emotional, behavioral, social. There's all these factors that are used. How do we actually identify them and instill them into programs so that we can actually then help other people use that sort of approaches to cope with adversity better? And, I always think he's a great example of that.
Richard, I couldn't think of a better way to conclude our interview with a smile. You truly are an amazing researcher. You make the world a better place. During this pandemic, you are clearly the right person for the right time. Thank you for taking part in this very special Plus Alliance discussion. It's part of a series we're doing with leaders across our 3 universities. And may I wish you all strength to you and your researchers in this incredibly important field. Thank you very much, Professor Richard Bryant.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to the Plus Alliance for having me.
All the best.